She set down her soup spoon without a word, and no one at the table noticed, which was, she had come to understand, the whole of her marriage in miniature. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of evening that settled into the bones before the fire had time to help. The dining room at Harwick House smelled of candle wax and boiled parsnips, and the chandelier above the table threw light that was not quite warm enough for any of the faces beneath it. There were 4 of them at dinner: Audra, her husband Reginald, his mother Mrs. Fenwick, and Mrs. Fenwick's unmarried sister, a thin woman named Cordelia, who had arrived 2 weeks earlier for what was described as a short visit and showed no sign of departure. Audra Blaine, though she had nearly forgotten that, had been married for 2 years and 4 months. She was 26 years old. She had come to the marriage by way of her father's debts and her mother's practicality, which together had arranged the whole business in the space of one autumn. And she had entered Harwick House in the first week of December with a small trunk and a smaller dowry, and every intention of making something decent of it. She had tried, that much she believed was true. She had learned the preferences of the cook. She had memorized which chairs in the parlor made Mrs. Fenwick's back ache, and which she preferred. She had read the accounts ledgers and found 2 errors that saved the household a not inconsequential sum. And she had said nothing about finding them, only corrected them quietly, and left the books on Reginald's desk. She had sewn curtains for the east-facing guest room, because the old ones let in the morning cold. She had done all of these things and a great many others, and the result was that she was considered, in the house at Harwick, to be adequately useful. Not pretty, not clever, not particularly good company, but useful, in the way a well-made piece of furniture was useful, present, functional, unremarkable. This was the understanding she had arrived at gradually, over the course of 2 years and 4 months, the way one arrives at an understanding of weather, not through any single storm but through the accumulation of smaller ones. Mrs. Fenwick had said, early in the marriage, that Audra's hair would look better if she wore it differently. She had said this in front of Reginald, who had said nothing. She had said, 6 months later, that Audra's manner with guests was a touch stiff, a little provincial, understandable given her background. She had said this in front of 3 guests, 1 of whom had looked away, and 2 of whom had looked at Audra with expressions she recognized as pity. Reginald had been at the window. He had appeared to be examining the latch. Audra had said nothing. She had smiled and turned the conversation, and later, in the privacy of their room, had waited for Reginald to say something. He had talked about the latch. There had been other things, across the months. The comment at breakfast about her posture. The remark at the Harcourts' dinner about her father's profession, said lightly, laughingly, as though it were simply an amusing fact about the world, rather than a blade slid neatly between her ribs. The morning Cordelia had arrived, and Mrs. Fenwick had introduced Audra to her own sister-in-law as Reginald's wife. She's from the Blaines, you know, the Somerset ones. Not the distinguished branch, as though Audra were a footnote to her own introduction. Each time Reginald had been present. Each time he had looked elsewhere. She had told herself in the beginning that it was not cruelty. She had told herself that he was a quiet man, a private man, a man not given to conflict, and that these were not shameful things to be. She had made allowances, the way women learn to make allowances, assembling them carefully like stones in a wall, until the wall was very tall and she was standing behind it and could barely see over the top. The evening of the last Tuesday in October began like all the others. They sat. The soup came. Mrs. Fenwick asked Cordelia about her journey to Gilmore the previous week, and Cordelia described it at some length. Reginald ate his soup. Audra ate hers. The fire was adequate. The parsnips were slightly overcooked, which Audra noted and filed away to mention to the cook in the morning. Then Mrs. Fenwick set down her own spoon and looked at Audra in the particular way she had. Not unkind, exactly, never quite unkind, only precise, the way a surgeon is precise, and said, "Reginald, I was looking at the portrait from your father's time this afternoon. Your grandmother was a very handsome woman. I suppose it skips, in some families. Beauty, I mean. It simply does not descend." She said it pleasantly. She reached for her water glass. Cordelia made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Reginald looked at his soup. Audra heard it the way she had learned to hear things in this house. At a slight remove, as though through glass, the words arriving clearly, but the impact softened by a layer of something she had been building for 2 years and 4 months. She heard it. She understood it. She set her spoon down without a word. And then something happened that had not happened before. She felt nothing soften. The words arrived and there was no glass between her and them, and they struck her cleanly, and the thing that rose in her chest, in response, was not grief and not shame, and not the particular exhaustion of swallowing something down again. It was something quieter and more decided than any of those. It was a door closing. She folded her napkin. She set it beside her bowl. She pushed her chair back from the table, slowly, without scraping, because she had been raised with manners, and she stood. "Excuse me," she said, to no one in particular, to all of them. The words were calm and unremarkable, and she meant them to be, because she wanted nothing of this moment to be dramatic. She wanted it to be simply true. She walked out of the dining room. She climbed the stairs. She went to the bedroom that had been described as theirs, but had always felt more accurately like the room adjacent to her real life. And she opened the wardrobe, and she began to pack. She was methodical about it, which surprised her. She had half expected to find her hands shaking, or her eyes hot, or some bodily rebellion against the clarity of what she was doing. Instead, she found only a kind of cool efficiency, the same efficiency she brought to the household accounts, and the mending and every other task that needed doing. She chose what was hers, truly hers, brought from her mother's house, or bought with the small allowance she was given for personal necessaries. And she left what was Harwick's. A shawl Reginald's aunt had sent 2 Christmases ago. A pair of gloves Mrs. Fenwick had given her once, in a gesture that may have been kindness and may have been something else. She left them folded on the chair. She packed her mother's letters. She packed the small watercolor of the house she'd grown up in, the one her younger brother had painted badly and given her with enormous pride. She packed her 2 best dresses and her everyday dress and her winter coat, and the boots that still fit properly. She packed her journal, though she had not written in it for 8 months. She packed the book of Keats she had carried since she was 17. Its spine cracked in 3 places from use. She did not pack anything she would have to explain. She had a little money, not much. The sort of money a careful woman saves from small economies, here and there, over 2 years, saying nothing about it. Enough. She sat on the edge of the bed with her trunk closed, and her coat across her arm and the house quiet below her. And she thought about her mother, and about what her mother would say. Her mother would be frightened. Her mother would say, "Where will you go, Audra? What will people think? Reginald is not a bad man. You knew what you were marrying. All marriages require." And there it was. All marriages require. She had required a great deal of herself across 2 years and 4 months. She wondered when anyone had inquired what was required of her. She stood. She lifted the trunk. It was heavier than she'd expected, and she set it down again and removed the second-best winter blanket she had apparently, without noticing, included, and left it folded on the bed. She lifted the trunk again. This time she could manage. The stairs were the difficult part, and she took them slowly. From the dining room she could hear the low murmur of voices, dinner continuing apparently, in her absence. She could not make out words. She did not try. She let herself out through the kitchen door, because it was closest to the road, and because the cook, Mrs. Brent, was in there finishing the washing up, and Mrs. Brent looked at her when she came through with the trunk, and Audra met her eyes and said only, "Good night, Mrs. Brent." And Mrs. Brent, who was a perceptive woman, and had been in service for 30 years, said, "Safe travels, ma'am," and did not ask a single question. Outside it was cold. The sky was very clear, which meant the cold went all the way through. Audra walked to the end of the Harwick Drive and stood at the road and took one breath, and then another, and then began walking north, toward Carver's Mill, where her mother's cousin kept a house. The walk was 4 miles, which was not nothing in October dark with a trunk, but she had walked it before in daylight and knew the way well enough. She stopped twice to rest her arms. The 3rd time she stopped, she set the trunk down and sat on it for a few minutes and looked up at the stars, which were everywhere, abundant and indifferent, and she felt something unknot in her chest that she had not realized was knotted. She thought about the dining room, about Mrs. Fenwick's voice, pleasant and precise, about Reginald's eyes on his soup. She had made herself smaller, she thought, in increments so gradual she had not noticed until she was nearly gone. She had filed down her edges. She had learned to take up less room at the table, not just physically, but in every way, in conversation and in laughter, and in the small daily insistences of personhood. She had become, in this house, someone she would not have recognized at 21. This was the thing that had made her stand. Not the cruelty of the words. She had absorbed cruelty before. It was the realization, arriving with the cold finality of a closing door, that she was disappearing. That if she sat at that table long enough, eating soup she had not seasoned, and looking at curtains she had sewn, and being described as the less distinguished branch of something that had never been distinguished to begin with, she would eventually vanish so thoroughly that there would be nothing left of her to recover. She was not willing to vanish. She stood. She picked up the trunk. She walked the remaining 2 miles to Carver's Mill. Her mother's cousin was a widow named Mrs. Holt, not Beatrice Holt from the file. She reminded herself of nothing so contained. But let us call her Mrs. Quinlan, a solid and unsentimental woman of 60, who ran her house with 2 servants and a kitchen garden, and no apparent interest in the opinions of her neighbors. She answered the door herself, as she always did at unusual hours, and she looked at Audra on her doorstep with the trunk at her feet, and the October cold in her face, and she said, "Come in then." No questions that night. Mrs. Quinlan heated milk and sat across from Audra at the kitchen table while the rest of the house slept, and Audra held the warm cup and said nothing for a while, and Mrs. Quinlan seemed to find this entirely reasonable. "He didn't strike you," Mrs. Quinlan said at last. "It was not quite a question." "No," Audra said. "Nothing like that." Mrs. Quinlan nodded, slowly. "Worse in some ways," she said. "The kind that doesn't leave marks." Audra looked at her cup. "You can stay here," Mrs. Quinlan said, "as long as you need. I won't hear otherwise." She paused. "Your mother will come. I know. I'll handle your mother." Audra looked up. There was something in Mrs. Quinlan's voice. A dry, particular competence. That was the first thing in a very long time that had made Audra want to laugh. "Thank you," she said. She slept that night in the guest room, with its slightly uneven floor, and its old quilt that smelled of lavender and cedar. And she slept through until nearly 9, which she had not done in 2 years. The days at Mrs. Quinlan's took on a shape that was different from anything Audra had known in the Harwick years. She helped where she could, and was refused where Mrs. Quinlan felt the help was unnecessary. She walked the lanes in the mornings. She wrote 3 letters, one to her mother, one to her brother, one to a school friend in Dorset named Philippa. No, she thought, checking herself. Call her Bess, a woman she had been close to before the marriage, and had drifted from in the way women drift from everything when marriage consumes the hours. The letters took her the better part of 2 days because she wrote them carefully, choosing each word. She was not dramatic in them. She stated what had happened and what she had done and what she intended. What she intended was not yet entirely clear, even to herself. But that was all right. She was beginning to understand that the clarity would come, and that it would come faster if she stopped forcing it. Her mother arrived on the 4th day, as Mrs. Quinlan had predicted, and the conversation was exactly what Audra had expected, and exactly what she had prepared for. Her mother was not unkind. Her mother was frightened, in the way women of her generation were frightened, of the particular consequences that fell on women who made irregular choices. She said, "What do you expect to do, Audra?" She said. "You knew the situation when you agreed to it." She said. "Reginald is not cruel, not properly cruel." "No," Audra agreed. "Not properly." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "He did not protect me," Audra said. "Once I could have forgiven. 10 times 100 I cannot. I will not continue in a house where I am treated as though I have no value, and where the person who is bound to stand beside me turns always to look at the window." Her mother was quiet. "I know what this means," Audra said. "I am not pretending otherwise. I know the difficulties. But I am 26 years old, and I am still here, and I think that is the thing that matters most." Her mother left that evening, not reconciled but not estranged, which was the best Audra had hoped for. She did not weep after her mother's carriage left. She stood at the window and watched the road for a while, and then she went back to her book of Keats and read until the light failed. She had been at Mrs. Quinlan's for 11 days when Reginald came. She had not expected him quickly. She had expected letters first, and there had been letters, 2 of them, formal and careful in Reginald's near architectural hand, saying that he hoped she was well, and that he wished to speak with her, and that surely they could reach some reasonable understanding. She had read both letters. She had not answered them. She had half decided, in the 11 days, that she would not answer them at all. She had also, in those 11 days, spent a good deal of time examining the version of Reginald she had assembled across the marriage. The quiet man, the private man, the man not given to conflict. She had constructed this version partly from observation, and partly from necessity, because the alternative, that he was simply a man who saw clearly and chose not to act, was harder to live with. She was no longer interested in making it easy to live with. When his carriage arrived on the morning of the 12th day, she watched from the upstairs window and felt something complicated move through her. She was not pleased to see him, and she was not glad, but she found she was not as cold as she had expected. She was something more complicated than cold. She was curious, in the way one becomes curious about a thing that has cost you greatly, wanting to understand the full accounting of it. Mrs. Quinlan showed him to the small sitting room and came upstairs and said, with the economy of a woman who found no particular need for softening, "He's here." I told him I'd ask. Your decision. Give me a few minutes, Audra said. She looked at herself in the glass. Not at her hair or her face. She had long since stopped caring what Mrs. Fenwick's opinions of these things were, but at her own expression. She wanted to see what she looked like now, after 12 days of sleep and walks in Keats and Mrs. Quinlan's kitchen. She looked like herself. Recognizably, undeniably herself, in a way she hadn't been for a while. She went downstairs. Reginald stood when she entered. He was taller than she always remembered him being when they were apart, and thinner, and there were shadows under his eyes she had not put there, which was interesting. He had driven from Harwick himself, without a man. She could see the road dust on his coat. Audra, he said. Reginald, she said. She sat. She did not invite him to sit, and he looked uncertain for a moment, and then sat anyway, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had seen him do. She waited. He was quiet for a longer stretch than she expected, and she was content to let it be long. She was in no hurry. I owe you an apology, he said at last. Yes, she said. A great many. He looked at her. There was something in his face she had not seen before, or perhaps she had seen it before and it had not registered because she had been too occupied with assembling walls to notice. It looked like embarrassment. Not the shallow embarrassment of being caught at something small, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from having looked clearly at oneself and found the image wanting. I did not protect you, he said. She said nothing. I told myself, he said, that my mother meant no real harm, that her remarks were. He stopped. I told myself a great many things that I think were not entirely true. Yes, Audra said. I think that is right. I am not. He paused again. He was not a man who found speech easy, which she had once thought was a kind of privacy, and had later understood was something more like avoidance. I am not asking you to return on any terms that would be unchanged. I know I have no right to ask you anything. You're asking nonetheless, she said. I'm asking, he said. Yes. She looked at him for a long time. She had prepared for this conversation in the abstract, had rehearsed it in the long walks, in the quiet mornings, but the actual fact of him, sitting in Mrs. Quinlan's sitting room with dust on his coat and shadows under his eyes, was somewhat different from the abstraction. She thought about the dining room. She thought about the latch. She thought about 1,000 small moments of looking away. If I returned, she said, it would not be to the house as it has been. Your mother would need to understand, not from me, but from you clearly, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that I am not subject to her opinions of my person, that I am your wife, not her project, that the house is mine to manage as I see fit. She paused. And if she cannot live in those terms, then she does not live in that house. Reginald was quiet. That is not a negotiation, Audra said. Those are the terms. She watched him work through it. She could see him doing it. The old calculations running. The old weights and counterweights, his mother's comfort and her mother's preferences, and the long-established habits of a house that had arranged itself around one woman's opinions for the better part of 30 years. She watched him find the weight of those calculations, and she watched him, for the first time, put them down. Yes, he said. She was quiet herself for a moment. And you, she said, will not look at the window. If something is said in that house that should not be said, you will say so, not for my sake alone. For the sake of what we are supposed to be to one another. I understand, he said. Understanding is not sufficient, she said, not unkindly. Doing is what I need. He nodded. He was not offended by this, which she noted. Perhaps he had done, in the 12 days, some version of what she had done. Looked at himself clearly, without the softening of habit. Will you come home, he said. The word home landed between them with a particular weight, and she sat with it for a moment. Harwick House had been a great many things to her across 2 years and 4 months, and home had not been chief among them. Not today, she said. I need another few days, and when I come it will be because I am choosing to come, not because the situation demands it. He accepted this. He stood. He looked for a moment, as though he might say something more, and then thought better of it, and she found she respected the restraint. He was nearly to the door when she said, Reginald. He turned. Your mother's remarks were not trivial, she said. I want you to understand that they accumulated. I want you to understand what that cost. He was quiet for a long time. I am beginning to, he said. She nodded once, and he left, and she listened to his carriage on the road outside, and then she went to find Mrs. Quinlan. Mrs. Quinlan was in the kitchen, making absolutely no pretense of not having been listening. Well, she said. Well, Audra agreed. You'll go back, I think so, in a few days. Mrs. Quinlan turned back to whatever she had been doing with the onions. He has an honest face when he's cornered, she said. I'll give him that. Audra sat down at the kitchen table. The afternoon light came through the window in long slants. The way it does in late October, when the angle is low, and the sky has gone that particular shade of pale. That means winter is coming but has not quite arrived. She thought about the east-facing guest room at Harwick with the curtains she had sewn. She thought about the kitchen accounts and the 2 errors she had found and corrected without saying anything. She would say something, she decided, about those errors, not as a recrimination, simply as information. I found these. I fixed them. It was a small thing, but she thought she was done with the habit of invisibility. She had been folded down for 2 years and 4 months. She intended, very deliberately, to unfold. Mrs. Quinlan, she said, would you teach me that thing you do with the apple cake? The thing with the brown sugar at the bottom? Mrs. Quinlan looked at her over her shoulder with an expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Figured you'd ask eventually, she said. And Audra laughed. A real one, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. And outside the window the October light shifted, and the road back to Harwick lay quiet under the pale sky waiting.